Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Climate Emergency Centre Wednesday night webinar. We've got the amazing Tim Lenton tonight, who is an expert on climate tipping points, but also very interesting to me is about societal tipping points. Professor Tim Lenton is a founding director of the Global Systems Institute and a chair in climate change at the Earth Systems Science at the University of Exeter. He recently addressed the national emergency briefing along with 10 top experts and professors from all across the UK. And it was a really incredible event. Over 1,250 people in Westminster Central Hall, about 140 MPs, and it's really building momentum towards the film coming out with all the small 10-minute talks from each of the professors and presenters. That comes out at the end of February, beginning of March. We're hoping everyone gets behind that, and we've been having some meetings to build momentum. So it's shown nationally all across the country in everything from cathedrals to town halls to sporting venues to local village halls and whatever it is, anywhere we can get this message out and give a message about the critical national emergency, but also that we need to get together and build resilience groups and work on solutions. And Tim, when I chat to you at the Green Gathering, you told me you also were into the societal tipping points. It'd be great to hear about those positive tipping points. We do have a hope if we can do something. So without too much further ado, Tim, thank you so much for coming and kicking the year off well to get mobilized. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Phoenix. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me along, and thanks for organising and building the community, folks. Yeah, I'll say a bit about the serious climate tipping point risks with a bit of a UK focus, but then I'll try to cheer you up with a bit about the positive tipping points that are starting to happen to accelerate the change we need. And I'll try and keep it to like 25 minutes or something, so we have lots of time for discussion. And I'll be kind of presenting material that's summarized in a thing called the Global Tipping Point Report. There we go. So when I've finished, I'll try and remember to stick a link to that in the chat. It's the second of two reports we've done, this one was for the launched ahead of the COP30 climate negotiations, updating the world on the risks from the Earth system tipping points we face, and also the radical acceleration of action that we need. Right, let's get underway. So, I'm going to talk a bit about the latest tipping point science, a bit about some of the deep challenges we'll be facing, including as a nation, if we cross some tipping points in the climate, and then what do we need to do to accelerate out of trouble or limit the risk and the damages. So on the science, let's start with a little movie. This is me or my friend Chris forcing a system towards a tipping point. So this could be a social system, or it could be a bit of the climate, like a coral reef. And the system's in the valley on the left. It's the ball rolling around in the valley. And there's another alternative stable state for the system. That's the other valley. And the way we're forcing this system is making the state that it started in less stable or resilient, as we say, and the other state more stable, until at the tipping point there, we see an abrupt, hard to reverse change. And it's a sort of self-propelling change from one state of the system to another. And those are key characteristics of a tipping point: self-accelerating change, hard to reverse, big consequences, could be good or bad, as we'll talk about. What's going on? We would talk about there being damping feedbacks in the system that maintain the old status quo, but they're getting weaker. And then there's some amplifiers within the system that are getting stronger all the time. And they take over and they rule the system at the tipping point. And they're strong enough to support a change where you could stop forcing the system, but you wouldn't be able to stop it tipping. Right. So I spent 20 years highlighting the risks that we're getting closer to crossing some major tipping points in the climate system, a few of which are sketched out here. And I'll say a bit more in a minute about the fact that unfortunately we've crossed the first tipping point for coral reef die off on a large scale in the tropics. But what this diagram is also trying to convey is that sort of in the black boxes, we identify some of the systems that can tip, and you see a quick summary of the evidence that changes are happening in a an accelerating way in a bad direction in those systems. But also by kind of connecting the systems up with the orange arrows, I'm trying to convey that as scientists, we know that tipping one thing can make tipping another more likely because we're living in this beautiful, complex, almost living, interconnected climate system and biosphere. But unfortunately, the way it's interconnected means, as I said, tipping one thing more often than not makes tipping another more likely. And that would raise the risk of a really bad cascade, we call it, um, where, yeah, you've got a cascade of bad tipping points. Now, that's the worst case scenario with climate change and the one we should be doing everything to avoid. I'll say a bit more about some of the specific tipping points. We've been busy summarizing what's our best estimate of how close some of these tipping points are, and this is just a summary of a few of them, with this gigantic thermometer being the global temperature, which is about 1.4 degrees centigrade above what's called the pre-industrial level. So whatever the average temperature was actually defined sometime in the middle of the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution was well underway. But yeah, we're at 1.4 degrees C. We're getting very close to the 1.5 degrees C limit, and we're going to go past it, sadly. But one of my messages will be that we need to be doing everything in our power to limit the overshoot of 1.5 degrees C of global warming. Because basically, the warmer it gets, the bigger the risk of crossing any given tipping point with big bad consequences in the climate. And the sort of red to yellow, we call them burning embers, the different tipping points, that's just conveying we're not sure where the tipping point is, but we're more sure for some systems like the coral reefs, we're already crossing it, than we are for others like the West Antarctic ice sheet. But for sure, the warmer it gets, the more likely we'll cross it. In fact, in the new tipping points report, we could tell the world tragically that at 1.4 degrees of warming, we've crossed the first major tipping point for widespread loss of warm water coral reefs. That's because the world has been uh, temporarily, at least, at about 1.5 degrees C of warming for the most of the last couple of years, and we've seen widespread dieback and massive extreme bleaching events for over 80% of the tropical coral reefs. And if you're wondering why should I care, apart from the fact that it's like a beautiful ecosystem that harbors over a quarter of marine biodiversity, it also provides some element of the livelihood of something like 500 million people. Coral reefs protect the coastlines behind them from storm surges in a world of rising seas. They provide a whole suite of what some of the academic economists call ecosystem services. As warming goes up, we also, in the latest science, see that the Amazon rainforest is at bigger risk than we thought it was of a dieback, where you'd switch from luscious rainforest to kind of degraded forest or what we call a savanna, like trees in a grassland. Um, and the combination of deforestation and climate change basically together bring the tipping point closer and mean there's a risk even below 2 degrees of global warming of losing large areas of this incredible ecosystem, which would be a tragedy for biodiversity, but also for 100 million or so people who live in the forest or live kind of downwind of the forest where they get their moisture supply from and rainfall from all the moisture the forest is busy recycling. And then the rest of us are all going to care because when you lose the Amazon, you lose quite a lot of carbon to the atmosphere, which adds to warming, and you lose quite a lot of reflective cloud cover, which adds to warming. So there's a couple of tipping points that are in the biosphere, if you like, and there are also tipping points in the physical climate, in the major ice sheets, but also in the circulation of the ocean and the aspects of the atmospheric circulation. And one of the biggest, or perhaps baddest tipping points is this one that can occur in what we call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC for short, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's referring to the red to blue kind of circuit or loop of water flowing in the Atlantic, where the red is the surface waters and blue are deep waters thousands of meters down heading south. And this overturning circulation, we know it can be tipped off because it's happened 25 times during the last ice age cycle. And we know that has radical effects on the climate, which I'll come to. But I'll just say a word about how does it work and what drives it. This label here, deep water formation on in two places either side of Greenland. That's kind of the crucial process that drives the circulation, which then maintains itself. So what's happening is you have like the Gulf Stream, which hopefully we've all heard about, heading northeastwards across the Atlantic. And as it goes, it's losing heat to the atmosphere and it's evaporating fresh water to the atmosphere. So that makes the water colder and saltier. And both of those things make the water denser. And the water gets dense enough either side of Greenland and in the depths of winter um, to basically be denser surface water than the water underneath, which is an unstable situation. And then the water will sink literally hundreds and potentially thousands of meters down and propel this return flow of cold water at depth, the Atlantic. The trouble is global warming and then melt of the Greenland ice sheet and all sorts of other sources of fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic are making those surface waters less dense, less prone to doing this critical process we call deep convection or deep water formation. And with that, we could see the shut off or the collapse of this great circulation. And we're going to care about that a lot. We'll see what it does to the UK in a minute. If you lose this circulation, it may take several decades to collapse completely, which should give us a bit of time to try to adjust. Let's have a look at what happens to the winters in the UK and northwestern Europe. Basically, on the right-hand side, we'll see that the Arctic sea ice makes a spectacular comeback because you lose this transport of heat that's profound and keeps us today in a mild climate. Instead of the Gulf Stream kind of coming past the UK, it turns right and wraps around past Spain, and we see none of it. And so the sea ice by December has reached the black line, by January the blue line, and by February it's down to the Wash and nearly at the Thames estuary. So the North Sea's frozen solid. Scotland's surrounded by frozen sea ice. The wind could be blowing like from around 2 or 3 points of the compass across a complete ice and snow surface, and unsurprisingly, that'll make it spectacularly colder in the winter here. Minus 20 degrees C in London is the 1 in 10 year extreme. Minus 30 degrees C in Edinburgh. 3 frozen months of the year in London. 5.5 frozen months of the year in Edinburgh, and yet the summers will be hotter than they are today. So the seasonality of our climate will be completely different, and our infrastructure will, I would surmise, struggle to cope. And many of us will want to leave the country. We won't be worrying about immigration to the UK. A lot of us, I think, will be desperately trying to leave if we enter this climate future. We've done some work previously, what it would do, for example, to food production in the UK, or in this case, England, Wales, and Scotland, Great Britain. And the short version is, if we have this tipping point, we eliminate arable farming in the UK. That's partly because it's got a shorter growing season, but it's a lot to do with the whole country getting a lot drier. A big source of sort of warm, moist air has been lost. Um, well, we already import more than half of our food, but we'd be nearing 100% in this scenario. But there'd be a bigger problem because there'd be a water crisis. That we calculated that there'd be not enough kind of snow and rainfall in the winter months, mostly snowfall, to get through the summer in the southeast of the country. So bigger problems there. And in the global picture, we know that when this tipping point happens, you severely disrupt the monsoons in West Africa and in India. And in fact, we made some simple estimates of how it would affect the viable area for growing staple crops like wheat and maize, and found that it was reduced by more than a half worldwide. So I think it would be a worldwide food security crisis unless, of course, everybody turned vegetarian. So that's to give you a horrible kind of example of a tipping point. And in the simulation I showed you, from a climate model where it was happening in a 2 degree warmer world. It doesn't happen in every model at that temperature, but if you ask me to state the odds, I'd say it was probably about Russian roulette odds of happening in the range 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, so like 1 in 6. So it's a pretty big risk we'll be carrying if we head towards 2 degrees of warming. Right, so that should tell you that we should be doing everything in our power to to try and not cross these big bad tipping points, but the window of kind of preventing those outcomes is rapidly closing. So the second bit of the talk is that we need to find and activate what I call the positive tipping points, which radically accelerate decarbonisation and limit this overshoot of 1.5 degrees C. Because the only way to stop the world warming up is to stop emitting the greenhouse gases that cause the warming. And that includes stopping all fossil fuel emissions as well as a load of emissions from the meat system. So
Yes,
what's
this is the
needed?
one we really need to pay attention to, folks. Let's get ready to
Yeah,
mobilize on these societal tipping points. Back over
yeah,
to you, Tim.
yeah. Absolutely. So, well, what's required, as usual, there's plenty of things that can be done, and we might be wise in governance to try to obviously prevent the bad tipping points, but prepare if we can't. But governance has a key role to play in what I'm going to talk about, the positive tipping points. Not the only role to play, though. I'll try to show you that bottom up action is crucial as well, and it even better if the bottom up and the top down start working together. So what's a positive tipping point? It's the same like movie or idea as before. We're in an unsustainable state of society and economy, like we're powered still by 80% fossil fuel energy, etc., etc. There's a bunch of damping feedbacks to maintain the fossil fuel status quo, like we're still subsidizing fossil fuel extraction, and many countries they subsidize consumption as well. But we all know there's an alternative stable state. We can have 100% renewable energy future, electrified economy. It's going to be a lot healthier and happier. And there'll be plenty of reinforcing feedback. There'll be plenty of things maintaining that state. How do you kind of get over the hump, or can the system, the stability of the incumbents be challenged, and can the system tip? Well, I'm going to show you that it can, and that specific actions, a whole range of actions, can make the incumbent way of doing things less stable and the alternative way of doing things more stable and attractive, lower the hilltop, and ultimately tip the system from one to the other. And that's already begun to be seen in some markets and some key technologies or activities, if you like. Like I'll talk a bit about power, electricity production, and a bit about mobility, personal mobility. So the UK presents a great example of a positive tipping point, and that's the killing off of coal power, which is the black line here. The green, blue, yellow are new renewables, as they're called. I'm not a big fan of bioenergy, by the way, but I put it on. I'm a big fan of the blue and the yellow. The tipping point here is in 2012, we got 40% of our power supply from burning coal. We know, hopefully, we all know that it's 0% now. Look how it fell off a cliff. The whole secret of tipping points is there are these strong amplifiers in a system, and in this case, there was some forcing of the system as well. Not least the fact that thanks to decades of campaigning and then the Climate Change Act, the government was making an effort on incentivizing the rollout of renewables, which you can see were growing exponentially, and they're the cheapest. Once they're installed, they're generating power for free. So you're going to take every bit of renewable electricity before you turn to a fossil fuel. Coal would have traditionally been the cheapest fossil fuel, but the government was busy introducing a carbon floor price, a very modest price on carbon emissions in the power sector, but they promised they would only ever increase it over time. And when they were doing that in 2013, 14, that basically turned the economics of burning coal bad, and it caused investors to start to withdraw their money from coal burning, which made it even less profitable, which made even more investors withdraw. And you see the net effect here. This meant in real terms that emissions from the power sector in the UK at the peak were declining by 10% year on year on the steep part here. And that's the kind of rate of emissions decline we need to be achieving across like all countries and sectors. But it proves it's possible. A different example is the Norwegians tipping from deciding to buy petrol and diesel cars to deciding to buy electric vehicles in the green colours. And that's also unfolded in just the last decade or so. And my own analysis puts the tipping point where that change became sort of self-propelling right back in 2012 or 13, when in Norway it cost about the same amount over the lifetime of a vehicle to own an electric vehicle as a petrol or diesel one, and you can see the consumers opted to switch. Now, that's a relatively small market, but we need to be caring about these things because power, the thing I showed you on the last slide, electricity production is like a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and just mobility on roads like cars, vans, trucks. That's 13%, 14% of greenhouse gas emissions, and most of it's cars. So these are big chunks of emissions. And we've just been publishing some work showing there are strong amplifiers, as there are for all of these clean technologies. But here's an example for batteries for electric vehicles. Basically, the more batteries you make, the cheaper they get. That's all the dotted lines on the left-hand scale. The bar chart is just the fleet of electric vehicles growing exponentially worldwide. It's doubling every year and a half. But the batteries get better the more you make them. It's called learning by doing, and you can get 3 times the range out of a massive battery that you could a decade ago. So that's pretty spectacular, and that's why these amplifiers are able to support what's now been a tipping of some major markets, like battery electric vehicles are taking over in the Asian markets, especially China, which is a massive market. And in our report, we go through a bunch of sectors and markets and try to give the world an update on how close are the different sectors and markets to a tipping point. Some things closer than others, clearly. So maybe some stuff we really care about, like nature positive farming and diet change, and not as or green steel, and not as far along as some of the examples I've given. I want to say a tiny bit about how we can bring forward positive tipping points. And then it's kind of two lines of attack. If you remember that original diagram with the valley, the hilltop, and the other valley, as campaigners, and activists, we might choose to campaign to weaken the damping feedbacks that maintain the fossil fuel status quo. In other words, campaign to stop the fossil fuel subsidies or not open up new oil and gas fields or whatever. But I'm also really interested in all of us as individuals, consumers, and in whatever job we have, by making choices about what we consume or adopt. Um, let's say, for the sake of argument, I chose to adopt an electric vehicle when I knew I had to change my car, and I knew still needed at least one car in the household. By doing so, I helped make it a little bit cheaper, a little bit more accessible, and a little bit better technology, and a bit more attractive for the next person to adopt. Anyway, that's what this slide really summarizes, that there's a two-pronged attack. Weaken the damping feedbacks to maintain the old status quo, participate in being part of the amplifiers that can propel change. And together that can make this self-propelling and irreversible change. And we've seen that for some of these key things. And we want to see it for lots of other stuff, like I think for diet change would be a big topic, but also for the other major bits of the energy system, like steel production or shipping or whatever. And of course, you can also have positive tipping points where demand reduces, and you can ask me more about that in the Q&A. I've got some nice examples of that. So what's also really encouraging is we're starting to see the evidence that the positive tipping points can cascade in a good way. So I'll just give one example. I mentioned how like Norway started triggering the tipping to electric vehicles. The further that tipping point spreads across markets, the less policy support it needs. And basically, we're overly assessing that we're pretty close to the point where um, electrifying mobility is just the best and the cheaper option, and everybody's going to adopt it. Certainly in China, that's what's happening. We can debate the Europe and the UK situation in a minute. The further we go down this path, the more irreversible and self-propelling the change becomes. Fine, that's useful. That'll tackle a chunk of emissions, but those cheap batteries then enable other tipping points like electrifying goods transport, trucking, and obviously what we're seeing in the majority world is big electrification of three-wheeled rickshaws in India, electrification of motorbikes and two-wheeled transport across Africa. These are changes underway. And the thing about mobility and cars, etc., is that's the major demand for oil. So already with this point underway, loads of oil that some companies thought they'd be able to sell, there won't be a market for it. So there's a whole lot of what's called stranded asset. Oil firms should be busy reinventing themselves, or they'll have to at some point. Pension funds need to be getting their money out of this stranded asset that's going to be devalued. And then the thing that I find really interesting, cheap batteries help enable the tipping point to renewable energy because you need cheap electricity storage to balance renewable energy supply and demand. Like it's dark now, I'm sat here using electricity, and the wind isn't blowing much outside, so there's not much wind and solar power. So, but it's okay as long as there's plenty of battery storage on the grid that could give me the excess electricity from when it was sunny earlier today and the wind was blowing. You get the idea. But at the same time, it's kind of good news the other way round as well, that ever cheaper renewable energy is incentivizing the tipping point to electrify transport, but also electrify everything else we can, like heating our homes, for example, with heat pumps. This is just some plots of our state-of-the-art data-based model projection of how basically renewable energy is already the cheapest source of new electricity worldwide, and solar power is getting cheaper fastest. Wind power is getting cheaper the more you deploy it, but solar power is getting cheaper quicker, which is why it's set to be the cheapest source of power. But well, it already is in much of the world, and will completely dominate by the end of the decade. But what I wanted to finish with maybe is that I just talked about how you had like this reinforcement between tipping in sort of road transport and in the power sector. Um, Also, how ever cheaper electricity that's going to incentivize those adopting those heat pumps. At least if we could get a sensible electricity pricing system and pass it on to the consumer. At the same time, an electrified heating building stock, that's an interesting thing that can reinforce the transition to renewable power. One thing that can happen is you can use our homes as, like, we call them thermal batteries, and like preheat them when there's an excess of renewable electricity, for example. So what we've been doing, without all the detail, is like modeling out for 72 world regions and these sectors, all the interactions between the sectors, and then different policies, what can bring forward tipping. And there's a lot of detail here, so I should maybe share the slides afterwards. But we're looking in the rows at the power sector, heating, cars and trucks. And in the columns, we're looking at how things will unfold under current policies. How would it be different if we had a widespread carbon tax? How would it be different if you had widespread subsidies? This is worldwide. And how would it be different if you had widespread mandate to phase out the fossil fuel technology and phase in the clean technology? Just concentrate on the column on the right, because that's where the big difference is. Basically, when governments are willing to mandate the phase out of fossil fuel technologies and the phase in of clean technologies, like banning petrol and diesel car sales in our market after 2030, that has a really strong effect, far stronger than taxes or subsidies or anything else we've looked at, in basically activating the amplifiers that I talked about, economies of scale, learning by doing, and achieving the tipping point for some of the sectors that otherwise wouldn't tip. And of course, as activists, we could choose to push for such policies and for them to be stuck with. So yeah, the message is one of trying to move from catastrophe to prosperity. I think that we've got to limit the overshoot of 1.5 degrees C as the only credible way to avoid, I think, their catastrophic risks from climate tipping points. I tried to show you how catastrophic this AMOC tipping point would be, that, and how we know that risk goes up with every fraction of a degree of warming. It'd be a catastrophe for our country if it happens. So we do have every incentive to come together. It's a mixture of like bottom-up collective action and decisive policies to phase out fossil fuel technologies that can basically tip the difference here. So we don't end up in the catastrophic future, and instead we end up in a future of a new kind of clean, green prosperity. So Yeah, thanks a lot, folks. Can download the report. Maybe the scan, if you're quick, you can scan the QR code. Otherwise, I'll just put the link in the chat if you want to read more.
Thank you so much, Tim. I just want to really thank you for coming in your busy schedules and really kicking the ball off and mobilising in 2026. We're hoping to get most of the NEB speakers, National Emergency Briefing speakers, in to talk. But just to say, coming up next webinars next Wednesday, we've got Linda Aspey from the Climate Psychology Alliance. Let's change the psychology around some things there, climate cafes, that kind of thing. Belle Jacobs, we talked a lot about food and diet on this January the 28th, the following Wednesday. Belle Jacobs is talking about shifting to animal culture, sorry, vegan diets. And then I think just booked this afternoon, Rupert Reed and Ed Jarvis on the 18th of February about funding a proper national resilience plan. We want to really mobilise this year. We need to get the funding, the resources, the spaces together. I'll just come back over to Tim for parting words, and that is packed with gold dust, all of that knowledge pouring out. Reminds me, quick story, the Gaia story. James Lovelock, he was up on the roof of World War II. They were bombing London, and he was up there with the top professors of psychology, chemistry, and all the rest. And they all downloaded all their information into him because they thought I could get bombed tomorrow and die. And he synthesized all these top professors into Gaia theory about it all connected and alive, living Earth. So thank you, Tim, for so much. Just over you for parting comments. Thank you so much
Oh
for coming.
wow. Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm glad you mentioned Jim, who is my friend and hero. Yeah, I think that's the deepest tipping point, the one he gave us, which is to the Gaia worldview, I'm going to call it. If we don't kind of realize that we depend on this living system that created a habitable atmosphere, a breathable atmosphere, habitable climate in the first place, and start like realigning with that, then we won't fundamentally get out of trouble. So it sounds slightly esoteric because I'm very practical. I think we need to do all the practical stuff I talked about, but it'll be the shift in worldview, like Donella Meadows taught us, that will ultimately rescue the situation. So thanks for being part of that, people, and the movement.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim. Let's mobilize for solutions this year, 2026, the year of the great turning. Hopefully, we look back, be a good ancestor, network solutions, and Tim's book. Remember your mission tonight. Network it or buy it. Thanks very much, guys. Keep networking. Love Phoenix and all the crew. Big love.